The Last Diner on Route 6. Part 1, The Beginning. The memory of that day still haunts me in the quiet hours between midnight and dawn. It wasn't something that happened years ago, something I had time to process and file away in the neat compartments of my mind. It happened just last month. It's something that still keeps me awake at night, wondering if I did enough or if I just hesitated too long. My name is Sarah Mitchell, and until that Tuesday afternoon, I believed I was a person who would always do the right thing. I was a kindergarten teacher, after all, someone who had dedicated her life to protecting children. My fiancé, Tim, was an engineer, practical and level-headed, the kind of man who could fix anything from a leaky faucet to a broken heart. We had built what I thought was a perfect life together in our small New England town, with our 1-year-old son Leo completing our family picture. That Thanksgiving, we had made the long drive down to West Virginia to visit my extended family. It was supposed to be a nice long weekend, a chance to show off Leo to relatives who hadn't yet met him, but it turned into a disaster almost from the moment we arrived. My mother's side of the family had always been complicated, a web of tensions and unspoken resentments that surfaced whenever we were all together. This year was no exception. Within hours of our arrival, old arguments were resurfacing, political differences were creating divides, and Leo, sensitive to the stress around him, had been fussy the entire time. To make matters worse, the weather had been awful. A cold front had moved in, bringing freezing rain that coated everything in a thin layer of ice. The power had gone out twice during our stay, forcing us to huddle together under blankets while my uncle told stories that were increasingly inappropriate with each glass of whiskey he consumed. We should just go home a day early, Tim had whispered to me on the second night, as we lay in the guest room bed listening to another argument erupt downstairs. Leo's not sleeping well, and honestly, neither am I. I had agreed reluctantly, feeling guilty for abandoning my family but desperate for the comfort of our own home. So we packed up early Tuesday morning, said our hasty goodbyes, and began the long journey back to New England. We had been on the road for about 6 hours by the time we pulled off at that exit in rural Pennsylvania. Leo had finally fallen asleep in his car seat, which was a small miracle after hours of his intermittent fussing. We were both absolutely drained, physically from the drive, emotionally from the family drama, and mentally from the constant vigilance required when traveling with a toddler. The stretch of highway we'd been traveling on was one of those endless ribbons of asphalt where you see nothing but trees for miles in every direction. The November landscape was bleak, bare branches clawing at a gray sky, occasional abandoned barn collapsing slowly into the earth. We needed gas and real food, not just the chips and cookies we'd been snacking on from gas stations along the way. The exit we took looked half abandoned, as if it had been forgotten by time and progress. There was a gas station that had definitely seen better days, with faded signs advertising prices from at least a decade ago. Next to it stood a diner called Patty's Place, its neon sign flickering intermittently despite the daylight hours. It looked like the kind of spot that locals went to, which usually meant the food would at least be decent and authentic. It was around 3 p.m. on a Tuesday, so the diner was mostly empty when we entered. It had that typical smell of old coffee and fryer grease, comforting in a weird way, like stepping back into a simpler time. The vinyl booths were cracked but clean, and the counter gleamed under the fluorescent lights despite its age. We grabbed a booth near the window so we could keep an eye on our car, mostly out of habit but also because Tim was particular about our new sedan. We ordered coffee immediately just to feel human again. The waitress, a tired-looking woman in her late 50s with a name tag that read Betty, pouring it without much ceremony. There were only 2 other tables occupied. One had an elderly man reading a newspaper, his glasses perched on the end of his nose as he carefully turned each page. The other, way in the back corner, had a couple with a young girl. I didn't pay them much attention at first. I was just happy to not be moving at 70 miles per hour, to have a moment of stillness in the midst of our chaotic journey. But after a few minutes, the vibe in the room started to feel heavy. You know that feeling when you walk into a room right after people have been arguing? There's a tension in the air, a thickness that you can almost taste. It felt like that, but it was completely silent. I glanced over at the corner booth. The man was big, wearing a trucker hat low over his eyes and a heavy canvas jacket, even though it was warm inside. His hands were large and rough-looking, resting on a table like 2 dormant animals. The woman was thin with nervous hands that kept tearing up a napkin into tiny pieces, creating a small pile of white confetti on the table beside her coffee cup. Then I looked at the girl. She must have been about 9 or 10 years old, with dark hair that looked matted at the back like it hadn't been brushed in days. She was sitting stiffly, perfectly still, staring down at a plate of untouched French fries that had probably gone cold long ago. What caught my eye was how she didn't fit with them. They looked rough, worn down by life. The man's face weathered and creased, the woman's skin stretched in over prominent cheekbones. But the girl looked, I don't know how to describe it other than well-kept underneath the messiness. Her jacket looked expensive, a nice bright pink puffer coat that stood out against the drab gray and brown clothes of the adults. It was the kind of coat you'd see in a catalog, not something that would naturally belong with this couple. Tim, I hissed, leaning across the table. Don't look right now, but that family in the corner is weirding me out. Tim took a sip of his coffee and casually glanced around the room, pretending to look for our waitress. The one in the back? Why? Just watch the girl, I said, keeping my voice low. We sat there for a few more minutes, picking at our burgers and fries. I kept watching them out of the corner of my eye. The girl hadn't taken a single bite of her food. The man said something to her. I couldn't hear what it was, but his body language was aggressive. He leaned in close, his bulk overshadowing her small frame, and she flinched. It was a tiny movement, but I saw it clearly. She shrank back into the vinyl booth as if trying to disappear into the cracked red leather. Then her eyes lifted and locked onto mine. It wasn't a normal look. It didn't have that bored curiosity kids usually have when they stare at strangers. Her eyes were wide, rimmed with red as if she had been crying recently. It was a look of pure, desperate terror that sent a cold spike right through my chest. I stopped chewing mid-bite, the food suddenly tasting like ash in my mouth. She held my gaze for a second that stretched into eternity, then quickly looked back down at her plate as a woman nudged her sharper with an elbow. Did you see that? I hissed to Tim, my heart starting to pound. Yeah, Tim said, his voice lower now. I don't like the way that guy is hovering over her. Suddenly, there was a loud clatter. The girl had dropped her fork onto the tile floor. The man sighed loudly, throwing his hands up in annoyance. For God's sake, Jenny, be careful, he snapped. It sounded rehearsed, like he was saying for our benefit. The girl mumbled a sorry that was barely audible. She slid off the booth to pick it up. Since we were a few tables away, she had to bend down in our direction. As she reached for the fork, she turned her head slightly toward me. Her hand, the one not reaching for the fork, was hidden from the couple by the tablecloth. She gave a tiny frantic wave. It wasn't a hello wave. Her fingers were splayed and shaking like she was trying to push something away, or maybe get my attention without them seeing. It lasted half a second before she snatched the fork and scrambled back into her seat. My heart started hammering against my ribs. Tim, she just signaled me under the table. Are you sure? Yes. She's terrified. Something is absolutely wrong here. That's not her family. We watched her for another minute. She dropped the fork again. This time, the man grabbed her arm as she tried to move. Leave it! He growled heavily enough that we heard it clearly across the quiet diner. She froze, then slowly sat back. But as she did, she looked at me again. She mouthed something. It was just one syllable. I couldn't read lips perfectly, but it looked so much like help. I felt sick. I looked at my own baby sleeping in his carrier on the table beside us. The thought of someone taking him, of him being that scared 10 years from now, made me want to throw up. We have to do something, I told Tim, my hand shaking. We can't just leave. If we're wrong, we look like idiots. If we're right and we do nothing. Okay, Tim said. He's always better in a crisis than I am. He took a deep breath. I'm going over there. What? No, Tim, that's dangerous. I need a reason. I need to get close enough to hear them. See how they react. What are you going to say? You can't just accuse them of kidnapping. He patted his pockets. My phone is almost dead. It's at like 4%. I'll ask for a power bank. It's stupid, but it's normal. Be careful. I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Tim stood up. I watched him walk casually across the diner. He didn't look threatening. He just looked like a tired dad in a flannel shirt and jeans, someone who wouldn't draw attention in a place like this. He stopped at their table. The Mun looked up immediately defensive. His shoulders tensed and he practically glared at Tim. "Hey, sorry to bother you folks," Tim said, putting on his best friendly guy voice. "We've been on the road for hours and my phone just died. My charger is buried in the trunk. You wouldn't happen to have a power bank I could borrow for 5 minutes just to make a call?" The Mun didn't even let him finish. "No, we don't have one." His tone was final. Most people would at least check their bags or say sorry politely. He just wanted Tim gone. Tim didn't move. He stood there for a second too long, just looking at them. The woman wouldn't meet his eyes. She was staring intently at her coffee cup as if trying to divine the future in its dark depths. The girl was looking at the table, tears silently dripping onto her jeans, making small dark circles on the denim. Tim took a gamble. It was stupid, brave, and reckless. "Cute kid," Tim said, nodding toward the girl. "She looks just like you. Is she yours?" The reaction was instant and violent. The Mun slammed his hand on the table. Silverware jumped. "Mind your own damn business, pal," he shouted. The woman looked up, terrified, but not of us, of the Mun. "It's time to go," she muttered, already sliding out of the booth. "We're leaving." The Mun snarled at Tim. He stood up, and he was huge, at least 6 feet 4 inches. He grabbed the girl by the upper arm hard enough that I saw her wince. She didn't make a sound, though she was too scared to cry out. "Wait," Tim said, backing up a step, his hands up. "I didn't mean to offend you." They didn't wait for a check. The Mun threw a crumpled $20 bill on the table, not nearly enough to cover their 3 meals, and practically dragged the girl toward the door. As they passed our table, the girl turned her head back one last time. Her face was a mask of pure despair. She knew we had tried, and she knew it hadn't worked. That look is going to haunt me until the day I die. The bell on the diner door jangled aggressively as they shoved their way out. "Call 911, Tim said, rushing back to our table. "Now, get their license plate." I was already fumbling with my phone. I ran to the window, but the diner had those half curtains that blocked the view of the parking lot unless you stood right up against the glass. By the time I got a clear view, a beat-up blue sedan was already peeling out a lot, gravel spraying everywhere. I couldn't read the plate. It was covered in mud, probably intentionally. I dialed 911, my voice shaking so badly that the operator had trouble understanding me at first. "I need to report a possible kidnapping," I stammered. "We're at Patty's place on Route 6. They just left. Blue sedan covered in mud. A man, a woman, and a little girl who looked terrified. The operator told us to stay put, and that an officer was on the way. We waited and waited. Every minute felt like an hour. I kept replaying the scene in my head. Could I have done something else? Should I have blocked the door, screamed fire, anything to keep them there? It took 30 minutes for a state trooper to arrive. 30 minutes. They could have been 20 miles away by then, down any number of back roads. The trooper was calm, almost frustratingly so. He took our statement, writing everything down in a small notebook. He asked us for descriptions. White male, 40s, heavy-set, baseball cap, canvas jacket. Tim recited, his jaw tight. White female, thin, nervous, brown hair. The girl was about 10 with dark hair and pink puffer jacket. The waitress, an older lady who had been in the kitchen during the confrontation, came out. She confirmed they hadn't paid the full bill and had acted strangely since they arrived. "Do you have cameras?" The trooper asked her. "Just one over the register and one by the door," she said. "But they're old." We all crowded into the tiny back office to watch the grainy footage on a small monitor. The trooper fast-forwarded to when they came in. The quality was terrible, but you could see them enter. The Mun had a firm grip on the girl's shoulder the entire time. The trooper paused the video and the girl looked up at the camera by the door. It was blurry, but her face was visible for a split second. He let out a slow breath and pulled out his phone. He scrolled for a minute, then held the screen up next to the monitor. It was a missing persons poster. "Is this her?" he asked. The photo on his phone was clearer, a smiling school picture, hair brushed neatly, looking happy and normal. But the eyes were the same. "Oh my God," I said, grabbing Tim's arm. "Yes, that's her." The trooper's calm demeanor vanished. He immediately grabbed his radio. "Dispatch, this is Unit 4 confirming visual ID on missing juvenile Jennifer Adams. Last seen at the diner on Route 6 30 minutes ago. Suspect vehicle is a blue sedan. Older model, possibly a Taurus or Impala. Plates obscured. Put out a bolo immediately." He looked back at us. "She's been missing for 3 months. She disappeared from a Greyhound bus station in Ohio. Her parents had been going out of their minds." I felt tears running down my face. She had been right there, 3 feet away from me. Did we do enough? I asked the trooper, desperate for some kind of reassurance. "We tried to stall them." "You did what you could," he said, but he wouldn't look me in the eye. He knew, just like we did, that we had been too slow. We had to leave eventually. We gave them our contact info and got back in our car. The rest of the drive home was dead silent. Neither of us turned on the radio. Leo woke up and started crying about an hour later, and I just climbed in the back seat and held him, sobbing into his little neck while Tim drove. I've checked the news every day since then. I've searched for Jennifer Adams' name constantly. There hasn't been a single update. They know who she is now. They know what the car looks like, but they haven't found them. Every time I close my eyes, I see her dropping that fork. I see that tiny, desperate wave under the table. We were so close to saving her, but we were worried about being rude. We were worried about being wrong. And because of that, she's still out there somewhere with them. Part 2, the aftermath. The first week after our encounter at Patty's place was a blur of phone calls, interviews, and sleepless nights. The state police in Pennsylvania had been in touch with us daily at first, asking for more details, clarifying descriptions, having us work with a sketch artist to create composite drawings of the mountain woman. Tim and I both took time off work. I couldn't face my classroom full of bright-eyed 5-year-olds without seeing Jennifer's terrified face every time I closed my eyes. Tim tried to go into his office but found himself staring blankly at blueprints, his mind constantly replaying the scene at the diner. Our apartment felt too small, too quiet. Leo, usually a source of joy and distraction, seemed like a fragile reminder of what could be lost. I found myself checking on him multiple times during the night, my heart racing until I could feel the gentle rise and fall of his breathing. On the third day, a detective from Pennsylvania drove to our home in New England to interview us again. Detective Miller was a woman in her late 40s with kind eyes that held a deep weariness, as if she'd seen too many cases like this one. "We've identified the man," she told us over coffee at our kitchen table. "His name is Marcus Thorne. He has a record, assault, burglary, a stint in prison for armed robbery. The woman is likely his sister, Rebecca Thorne. She has a few minor offenses, mostly related to drug possession." "What about Jennifer?" I asked, my hands trembling as I held my coffee mug. "Do they know why they took her?" Detective Miller sighed. "We're not entirely sure. Thorne was released from prison about 6 months before Jennifer disappeared. We think he may have known her family somehow, possibly from before his incarceration. There's some indication he may have held a grudge against them." Is she okay?" Tim asked, the question hanging in the air. "We don't know," the detective said honestly. "There have been no sightings since you saw them at the diner. We've checked Thorne's known associates, his former neighborhoods, places he might have gone to ground. Nothing." The detective left us with her card and a promise to keep us updated, but we both knew that in cases like this, the trail often went cold quickly. The first 48 hours were critical, and those had long passed. That night, Tim and I talked for hours, something we hadn't done much since returning from West Virginia. We sat on our couch, the TV off, just the soft glow of a lamp illuminating our faces. "I keep thinking about what we could have done differently," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "If I had just stood up and screamed when he grabbed her arm." Then what, Sarah? Tim asked gently, taking my hand. He was a big guy. He could have hurt you, or me, or even a girl. We called the police as soon as they left. But it was too late, I said, tears streaming down my face. We were right there. We saw her. We knew something was wrong, and we still let them walk out of that diner. We didn't let them, Tim corrected. We tried to intervene. I approached them. We called 911 immediately. We did what we could. It wasn't enough, I whispered. Tim pulled me into his arms, and I cried against his shoulder, releasing all the fear and guilt that had been building up inside me since the afternoon at Patty's place. The next morning, I made a decision. I called the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children and asked how I could help. They connected me with a local organization that worked on missing children cases, and within a week, I was volunteering my time, making phone calls, organizing search efforts, and creating social media campaigns to spread awareness about Jennifer and other missing children. Tim threw himself into his work, but he also started researching home security systems, child safety protocols, and self-defense classes. We both had been changed by what we had witnessed, and we were trying to channel that change into something productive. 2 weeks after our encounter at the diner, we received a call from Detective Miller. They had a lead. Someone reported seeing a blue sedan matching the description at a campground about 50 miles from where you saw them, she said. The campground manager said a man and woman fitting the descriptions paid cash for 3 nights but left after just 1. Did they see the girl? I asked, my heart racing. No, the detective admitted. But they did find something in the cabin they used, a pink hair tie that looks like it might belong to a child. We're sending it to the lab for DNA testing. It wasn't much, but it was something. For the first time in weeks, I felt a flicker of hope. Part 3, the investigation. The next month passed in a strange rhythm of normalcy and obsession. During the day, I taught my kindergarten class, sang the alphabet song, and comforted children who missed their parents. But in the evenings and on weekends, I worked tirelessly on Jennifer's case and others like it. Tim and I had become unofficial advocates for missing children, attending meetings, speaking at community events, and working closely with law enforcement whenever possible. Our story had gained some local media attention, and we used that visibility to spread awareness about other missing children. The pink hair tie found at the campground had been a dead end. No usable DNA could be extracted from it. The trail had gone cold again, and Detective Miller warned us that this was often how these cases went. Periods of intense activity followed by frustrating silence. But we refused to give up hope. We had connected with Jennifer's parents through the detective and had spoken with them several times on the phone. They were grateful for our efforts but devastated by the lack of progress. Hearing the mother's voice break as she talked about her daughter made me even more determined to help. It was Tim who noticed a pattern first. He had been creating a map of sightings and leads related to Jennifer's case, pinning locations to a large map he'd hung in our home office. They're moving in a circle, he said one evening, calling me over to look at his work. Look here, they were spotted near Columbus when she was taken. Then they were seen in Pittsburgh a month later. Your sighting at Patty's place puts them further east. And now the campground lead. I leaned in to look at the red pins connected by string on the map. What's the significance? I'm not sure yet, Tim admitted, but it's not random. There's a pattern here. They're not just running blindly. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about Tim's observation. If there was a pattern, what was it? What was drawing Marcus and Rebecca Thorne to these specific locations? The next day, I took a personal day from work and drove to the state police headquarters where Detective Miller worked. I brought Tim's map with me. The detective studied it carefully, her brow furrowed in concentration. You might be onto something, she said finally. Let me see what I can find out about these locations. 3 days later, she called us with surprising news. You were right about the pattern, she said. All these locations have one thing in common. They're all within 50 miles of prisons where Marcus Thorne was incarcerated. Tim and I looked at each other, the same thought dawning on both of us. He's visiting people he knew from prison. I said, exactly. Detective Miller confirmed. We're cross-referencing visitor logs from these prisons with known associates of Thorne. It's a long shot, but it's the most promising lead we've had in months. The detective asked if we would be willing to help with the investigation in a more official capacity. We agreed without hesitation. The following week, we found ourselves in a conference room with a team of detectives and FBI agents, poring over prison records, visitor logs, and surveillance footage. It was grueling work, hours of staring at grainy images and lists of names, but we were fueled by the thought that we might be getting closer to finding Jennifer. It was Tim who spotted him, a man named Raymond Ray Stokes who had visited Thorne in prison 3 times and whose last known address was near the campground where the hair tie had been found. "This has to be it," Tim said, pointing to connection on a whiteboard covered in notes and diagrams. "Stokes is a link." The investigation moved quickly after that. Surveillance was set up at Stokes' known addresses, and a warrant was obtained for his phone records. Within 48 hours, they had a hit. A call from a disposable phone to Stokes' number, traced to a location near the Pennsylvania-Ohio border. A task force was assembled, and Tim and I were asked to stay back as they moved in on the location. It was frustrating to be left behind, but we understood we were civilians, and this was now a police operation. We waited at home, the silence of our apartment punctuated by the occasional text update from Detective Miller. The hours crawled by as we imagined what was happening 300 miles away. At 7:43 p.m., the text came. "We have them. Jennifer is safe. She's being taken to the hospital now." I collapsed into Tim's arms, sobbing with relief and exhaustion. After all this time, after all the worry and guilt, she was safe. Part 4, the reunion. 2 days later, we drove to Ohio to meet Jennifer's parents and to be there when Jennifer was released from the hospital. The reunion was arranged by the detective, who felt it was important for all of us to have closure. The hospital waiting room was tense with anticipation. Jennifer's parents, Mark and Lisa Adams, sat huddled together on a couch, holding hands tightly. They were thinner than I expected, their faces etched with the strain of the past 3 months, but their eyes held a glimmer of hope. When the door opened and Jennifer walked in, flanked by a child psychologist and a social worker, time seemed to stand still. She looked smaller than I remembered, her face pale and her eyes shadowed. She was wearing clean clothes, a simple t-shirt and jeans, but her eyes scanned the room warily as if still expecting danger. When her parents rushed to embrace her, she stood stiffly at first, then slowly relaxed into their arms. I felt tears welling up as I watched them, a family reunited after months of uncertainty and fear. After a few minutes, the psychologist approached us. "Jennifer would like to meet you," she said softly. We walked over to where the family was gathered. Jennifer looked up at us, her expression unreadable. "You're the people from the diner," she said, her voice quiet but clear. "We are," I said, kneeling down to her level. "I'm Sarah, and this is Tim." "Thank you," she said simply, her eyes meeting mine. "I saw you. I knew you were trying to help." Tears streamed down my face as I reached out and gently squeezed her hand. "We're so glad you're safe, Jennifer." The reunion was emotional but brief. The psychologist had warned us that Jennifer would need time and space to process what had happened to her. But in those few moments, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders that I hadn't even realized I was carrying. Later that day, we met with Detective Miller to hear the full story. Marcus and Rebecca Thorne had been staying with Raymond Stokes, who had been an accomplice in their crimes. Jennifer had been kept in a basement room, but had been treated relatively well, fed regularly, allowed to wash and change clothes, and never physically harmed. The motive was revenge, Detective Miller explained. Thorne believed Jennifer's father had testified against him at a parole hearing years ago, which resulted in his sentence being extended. He wanted to punish the family by taking their daughter away. It was a twisted logic that made no sense to me, but then again, the minds of criminals rarely operated on the same principles as the rest of us. As we drove home the next day, the landscape seemed brighter, more hopeful. The bare branches of the trees looked like lace against the sky, and the occasional farmhouse we passed seemed cozy and secure. "We did the right thing," Tim said, reaching over to take my hand as he drove. "We may have hesitated at first, but we acted when it mattered." "I know," I said, squeezing his hand back. But I still think about what could have happened if we hadn't noticed her, if we hadn't called the police. We can't live in the what-ifs, Tim said gently. All we can do is learn from our experiences and move forward. Hashtag part 5, moving forward. Life gradually returned to a new version of normal in the months that followed. Jennifer was reunited with her family and was receiving counseling to help her process the trauma she had experienced. The Thorns and Raymond Stokes were in custody, facing multiple charges that would likely keep them behind bars for a long time. Tim and I became advocates for missing children, speaking at conferences and helping to develop training programs for service industry workers, teaching them to recognize the signs that a child might be in danger, just as we had recognized Jennifer's silent plea for help. Our experience had changed us in profound ways. We were more vigilant, more aware of our surroundings, and more appreciative of the safety and security we had always taken for granted. But we were also more compassionate, more understanding of the fragility of happiness, and more committed to making a difference in whatever ways we could. One evening, about 6 months after our encounter at Patty's place, the phone rang. It was Lisa Adams, Jennifer's mother. "I'm calling to invite you to Jennifer's birthday party," she said, her voice warm and filled with joy that had been absent when we first spoke. "She'll be 11 next week, and she specifically asked if you and Tim could come." "We'd be honored," I said, my heart swelling with emotion. The party was held at the Adams home in Ohio, a cheerful, welcoming house filled with balloons, streamers, and the laughter of children. Jennifer looked like a different girl from the frightened child we had first met in the hospital. Her eyes were bright, her smile genuine, and she moved with a confidence that spoke to her resilience. When she saw us, she ran over and threw her arms around both of us. "I'm so glad you came," she said, her face beaming. "We wouldn't miss it for the world," Tim said, ruffling her hair gently. As we watched Jennifer blow out the candles on her cake, surrounded by family and friends, I felt a profound sense of gratitude. Our brief encounter with her had changed the course of her life, and ours, in ways we were still discovering. That night, as we drove home, Tim and I talked about the future. "I've been thinking," Tim said, his eyes on the dark highway ahead. "What if we started a foundation? Something to help families of missing children, to provide resources and support during those critical first hours and days." "I love that idea," I said, my mind already racing with possibilities. "We could call it the Jennifer Project." "The Jennifer Project," Tim repeated, smiling. "I think she'd like that." In the years that followed, the Jennifer Project grew from a small local initiative to a national organization that helped reunite dozens of missing children with their families. We never forgot the terrified little girl in the pink puffer coat who had silently asked for help in a roadside diner in rural Pennsylvania. Sometimes, on quiet nights when sleep eludes me, I still see her face in my mind's eye. But now, that image is followed by another, Jennifer at her birthday party, surrounded by love and laughter, safe and home where she belonged. We had hesitated, questioned ourselves, and wondered if we were doing enough. But in the end, we had made a difference, not just for Jennifer, but for many other children who would find their way home because of what we learned that day at Patty's place. And as I watch Leo sleep in his bed, his chest rising and falling in a gentle rhythm, I make a silent promise to always be vigilant, to always trust my instincts, and to always do what I can to protect those who cannot protect themselves. Because in the end, that's what matters, not the fear or the hesitation, but the choice to act, to help, to make a difference in whatever small way we can.